Bob Wire, the 18th episode of the 6th season of Have Gun, Will Travel, begins with Paladin at the Carlton Hotel in San Francisco, where his usual professional routine is interrupted by a small but amusing problem involving his famous business cards. Maggie, one of the hotel employees, notices that Paladin seems to be missing a large number of cards and eventually reveals that more than 100 have disappeared. The explanation leads Paladin to Big John Donovan, Maggie's fiancé, who is preparing to enter the printing business. Big John has been experimenting with ideas for new business cards and believes he can improve Paladin's familiar advertisement. Paladin, however, has little interest in changing the identity that has made him famous. Instead, he orders a new supply of cards and prepares to return to his normal work. Before long, a stranger named Bob Wire arrives with an unusual proposition. Bob is a salesman whose business is barbed wire, and he needs Paladin to accompany him and protect a wagon load of his merchandise on a long journey to Anderson. Bob offers Paladin a substantial payment of $1,000 if he can guarantee that the shipment arrives safely. Paladin accepts the assignment because transporting valuable goods through dangerous territory is precisely the kind of work for which his reputation was built. At first, the job appears relatively straightforward. Bob has a wagon loaded with rolls of barbed wire, and Paladin is expected to ride alongside him and make certain that nobody interferes with the delivery. However, Bob has deliberately withheld an important detail. The shipment is not merely valuable because of its price. In Anderson, barbed wire has become the center of a bitter struggle over land, property, and the future of the local ranching economy. By the time Paladin reaches the town, he realizes that the wire could become the spark that ignites a full-scale range war. The local cattlemen strongly oppose the spread of barbed wire fences because fencing changes the traditional use of open range. For generations, cattle have been allowed to roam freely across large areas of land, and ranchers have depended on access to unfenced territory. Farmers, on the other hand, want to protect their crops and property. Barbed wire offers them a cheap and effective way to mark boundaries, keep livestock out of fields, and establish greater control over their land. The conflict is therefore about much more than a shipment of wire. It represents a clash between two different ways of life. Bob Wire initially appears more concerned with selling his merchandise than understanding the consequences of introducing it into such a divided community. Paladin quickly recognizes that the situation is much more dangerous than Bob has admitted. The arrival of the wagon attracts attention, suspicion, and hostility from local cattlemen. They understand exactly what the wire represents and regard it as a direct threat to their interests. Paladin finds himself surrounded by men who are prepared to use violence to prevent the shipment from being distributed. Rather than immediately drawing his gun, Paladin attempts to understand both sides of the dispute. This is one of the central characteristics of his role throughout Have Gun, Will Travel. Although he is a professional gunfighter, Paladin is rarely eager to solve every problem with violence. He understands that a gun can end an argument, but it cannot necessarily solve the problem that created the argument in the first place. The tension in Anderson continues to rise as Paladin and Bob attempt to negotiate a way to sell the wire without provoking a bloody confrontation. The situation becomes even more complicated when different groups attempt to secure the shipment for themselves. Paladin realizes that there may be a financial opportunity hidden inside the conflict, but he also understands that any careless move could result in several men reaching for their weapons. Bob is primarily interested in completing the sale and making money, while Paladin becomes increasingly concerned with preventing the town from descending into violence. As negotiations continue, Paladin deals with representatives of the local cattle interests and considers how the wire might be distributed in a way that benefits more than one side. One of the most interesting aspects of the episode is the way Paladin transforms the problem from a fight over whether barbed wire should exist into a practical question of how different types of fencing can be used together. Instead of allowing the cattlemen and farmers to treat the issue as an absolute choice between open range and total fencing, he proposes a compromise involving both barbed wire and smooth wire. This solution allows the farmers to protect their crops while giving cattlemen a way to maintain access and reduce the danger of livestock being injured, or trapped by improperly placed fencing. Paladin's proposal demonstrates that the real obstacle is not the technology itself, but the unwillingness of the opposing groups to negotiate. The men have become so focused on defending their traditional interests that they are prepared to fight over the issue rather than search for a workable compromise. Paladin refuses to accept that violence is inevitable. His reputation gives him enough authority to make the people around him listen. But his intelligence and ability to negotiate are what ultimately allow him to control the situation. The episode also contains several moments in which Bob Wire's honesty is questioned. Paladin gradually realizes that Bob has not told him everything about the shipment or the business arrangements surrounding it. The salesman wants to make as much money as possible from the situation and is willing to negotiate with different parties. Even when doing so increases the possibility of conflict. Paladin is therefore forced to protect not only the shipment, but also himself from the consequences of Bob's decisions. At one point, Paladin becomes involved in negotiations involving both Anderson and another interested party, TAG. The business dealings become increasingly complicated, with the value of the wire and the competing demands of the local groups creating additional tension. Paladin manages to negotiate a sale that gives the different factions a reason to cooperate rather than fight. The wire is eventually divided between competing interests, with Anderson agreeing to purchase a significant portion and TAG taking another portion. According to the episode recap, Paladin negotiates a sale of part of the shipment to Anderson for $4,000, while Wire sells another portion to TAG for $3,000. What matters most, however, is not the money but the fact that the potential range war is defused. The farmers get access to fencing materials, while the cattlemen realize that compromise may be preferable to open warfare. Paladin's solution is characteristic of the series because it demonstrates that his greatest weapon is not always his pistol. He is capable of using force when absolutely necessary, but he also understands economics, human behavior, pride, and fear. He recognizes that the men in Anderson are not necessarily evil. They are frightened that their livelihoods are being threatened, and that fear has made them aggressive. The farmers are equally determined to protect their property and crops. By finding a middle ground, Paladin gives both groups a way to retreat without appearing to surrender. This is an important part of successful negotiation in the violent world of the Old West. A compromise works only when both sides can accept it without believing that they have been humiliated. The climax, therefore, does not depend on a traditional gunfight. Instead, the tension is resolved through Paladin's ability to manipulate the situation before it becomes irreversible. The episode reinforces one of the most important themes of Have Gun, Will Travel. Violence is often the easiest answer, but rarely the smartest one. Paladin has built his reputation as a gunfighter, yet he repeatedly demonstrates that intelligence and restraint are more valuable than speed with a revolver. His willingness to listen and negotiate separates him from the ordinary hired guns who populate many Western stories. After the dispute is settled and the commercial arrangements are completed, Paladin's work is essentially finished. He has protected the shipment, fulfilled his professional obligation, and prevented a potentially disastrous conflict from turning into a genuine range war. Bob Wire, meanwhile, has achieved the business success he wanted, although Paladin has little reason to admire the way he handled the assignment. Paladin ultimately chooses not to continue traveling with Bob, making it clear that the relationship was purely professional. The episode ends with Paladin returning to the world from which he came, ready for another assignment. His famous business card slogan, "Have Gun, Will Travel," once again becomes an appropriate summary of his profession and lifestyle. Bob Wire is an especially interesting episode because it takes a seemingly ordinary object, barbed wire, and turns it into the center of a major social and economic conflict. The wire represents the transformation of the American West. Open ranges are beginning to disappear as land becomes divided, privately controlled, and increasingly organized around agriculture and permanent property boundaries. The conflict between cattlemen and farmers therefore reflects a much larger historical transition. The Old West is changing, and people who built their lives around older traditions are being forced to adapt. Paladin stands between these competing worlds. He understands the old culture of guns, cattle, open territory, and personal independence. But he is also intelligent enough to recognize that progress cannot simply be stopped by violence. His solution is practical rather than sentimental. He does not pretend that one side can completely defeat the other. Instead, he searches for a system in which both sides can survive. The episode also shows why Paladin is such an unusual Western protagonist. He is neither a simple lawman nor an outlaw. He works for money, but he has his own moral standards. He accepts dangerous assignments, yet he does not automatically obey every client. When a client's actions threaten innocent people or risk creating unnecessary bloodshed, Paladin is willing to take control of the situation himself. His professionalism is therefore balanced by an independent sense of judgment. In Barbed Wire, this quality becomes especially important because the client who hires him is not entirely trustworthy, and the assignment is more complicated than originally advertised. Paladin does not simply follow Bob's instructions from beginning to end. He evaluates the situation and chooses what he believes will prevent unnecessary violence. The episode ultimately presents Paladin as a mediator as much as a gunfighter. He enters Anderson expecting to protect a wagon, but he ends up protecting an entire community from the consequences of its own anger. The barbed wire may be the physical object at the center of the dispute, but pride, fear, money, and competing ideas about the future are the real causes of the conflict. Paladin understands this and refuses to let those emotions push the town into bloodshed. By introducing a compromise involving different kinds of fencing, he gives the opposing sides a practical solution and prevents the situation from escalating into a range war. The story concludes with the conflict settled and the immediate danger removed. Paladin has once again completed a difficult assignment without relying solely on violence. Barbed Wire, therefore, stands as a strong example of the thoughtful Western storytelling that made Have Gun Will Travel distinctive. The episode explores the economic and social changes transforming frontier life. Barbed wire becomes a symbol of that transformation, dividing land just as the argument divides the community. Paladin's role is to find a way through that division. His success comes from recognizing that people who seem to be enemies may still have common interests if someone can convince them to look beyond their immediate anger. In the end, Paladin proves that a professional gunfighter does not always need to fire his gun to do his job. Sometimes the most impressive victory is the one in which nobody gets shot at all.